Give us some details that I know folks in the audience want to know, and particularly want you to talk a little bit about caseload composition, how it's going to be determined, and how clients will be referred.
We received the contract approximately a month ago. They give us rule of time of about 30 days to get your folks in order, identify your office location, et cetera, and integrate into the community. So we conducted our training with all of our case managers the first week of May, and received our first referral list the second week of May. So our outreach has begun from the referral list that we received. So how do we get referrals? Primarily our referrals come through the state, through Texas Health and Human Services Commission, and those come to the state through a variety of resources. The United Way is a contributor to that list. The federal IDCM program, which is operated which is a mission assignment from FEMA to OSEPR, the Office of Human Services Emergency Preparedness and Response, and that is a federal contract, and that information flows from the feds to the state and down to the case management providers. We also received the referrals from TSA, the Transitional Sheltering Assistance Program, where individuals were housed or continue to be housed in hotels. And all of those resources or all of those lists are compiled together and are distributed amongst our case managers. The program really prescribes that each case manager carry a caseload of about 35. So depending on how that outreach works, the individuals that we receive on those lists have either had all of their needs met, have moved on, have moved out, or still have unmet needs. And so we create our case composition based on the needs, based on those referrals that we receive. Now, we can receive additional referrals. The primary resource going forward for referrals is going to be through 211 and United Way. So as those calls come into 211, they will go to Texas Health and Human Services Commission, who will then assign the cases to either the National VOED, to BCFS, or to Endeavors, which is the other state contracted case management provider. And they primarily are covering from the Houston-Harris County area east over to Orange, Jasper, Newton, Beaumont, Port Arthur, that area. The connection that we make with a disaster survivor starts with a phone call, and then we set up an appointment with them, go through a disaster recovery plan, identify additional unmet needs, and then we will coordinate and work with the local resources, local LTRCs, LTRGs, whichever they may be in a particular area, ONAs, other needs assistance committees, and other unmet needs committees, and working to be sure that those disaster survivors have the needs that they have the needs that they have met. We will work to follow up with them and ensure that whatever appointments they have set up, they were able to complete and get back to recovery.
Okay, thank you for the overview. I appreciate it. Dan, based on your previous experience, particularly with National VOED, can you talk a little bit about how case management agencies should be approaching these new case managers from the state and the federal perspective? So bringing the old into the new?
This has been pretty confusing, hasn't it? Well, we're going to get ready to go through another phase of confusion, and so will our residents, our neighbors, too. It's going to be happening. I don't really see any way around it that it's going to be confusing, so we all have to really be their advocates and help them through this as we all learn and gain information about how it's all working, because we have multiple systems that are disparate, and nobody was ever in charge from the beginning. There wasn't a coordinated system. There was no integrated case management even when the first awards went out. It is what it is, okay? And so that's all coming together now. But it's going to be difficult. So all these new federal, state funding and the FEMA coordination, there's a lot of great protocols. They really know what they're doing, okay? So there's going to be these massive systems coming into play. You're hearing about one of the partners here. They're going to be coming into play, and a lot of your clients are going to already be identified as being clients that they're supposed to work with. And so I think instead of being frustrated about that, the trick is to figure out, okay, how do we help our neighbors be not frustrated? How can we work to coordinate, be a team, Some organizations here might be case managers, but they might not be long-term kind of comprehensive case managers. You might have only one service or two things you do. So just think of yourselves that way. Your programs are short-term unless you do have permanent long-term programs. And that you've got these other teams coming in, they're going to take care of your people, the people you're dedicated to helping. So I think if you approach it that way, it's an opportunity. And let people know that, hey, we have some new resources coming in to coordinate. So I think it's going to be a little confusing at first for people. The city's also going to be deploying a program soon. There's HUD money coming in, and they have private corporations that are getting the bids, and I think they have to give 20% of their work to nonprofits. And so that's going to create another interesting complexity. But in the midst of all this, there's also going to be a lot of resources for the long-term recovery committees, for housing, all sorts of other things. So we just need to be patient with this reality, that this got always kind of like the disaster after the disaster. I think that's the thing, and just realize, okay, it's an opportunity for our communities. What can we do to help facilitate that confusion and get them on a track so that they can have recovery?
Let's start with you. Michelle, talk to us a little bit about the difference between case management and disaster case management.
All right, that's a very good question. So I would say, I would start off by saying with disaster case management and how it differs from your traditional case management is that disaster case management is really time focused, and it is specific to disaster related needs. And so in disaster case management, the focus really is on those things that individuals may have suffered or lost as a result of a disaster. With your traditional case management, what you see a lot of times are your chronic social service needs, and you may not specifically deal with just disaster related issues. Now, one of the things about, disaster case management and traditional case management, if you Google it, you will find a lot of different definitions for case management. And so for us, when we think about disaster case management, we do have to kind of sit back and think about what is our scope of work, because it's so easy to kind of creep into what we call traditional case management, but really, again, it's just really focusing on those things. Now, there may be points in times when we may have to address some of those chronic social service needs, and we do that if it hinders the neighbor's ability to recover. And so, you may have to work on employment or, some of the basic needs like food. But basically, if you just think about it in terms of helping a person to recover to the point where they were before disaster, or helping them find their new normal.
So Glenda, I'm going to hop over to you. So talk to me about when you determine this person needs disaster case management. What is that criteria for y'all?
For us, because Houston Area Urban League is a HUD-approved housing counseling agency, what we're following is HUD's template for disaster housing counseling that's now charged to our housing counselors. And so it's a comprehensive approach, very similar to what we did in dealing with the mortgage crisis, the housing crisis that occurred, where there's an initial overall assessment of need to determine exactly where the client is, to get the buy-in of the client as to what exactly their expectation is. And then if it is to actually address the issues impacted by the disaster, then to go about establishing a plan of action as to what that recovery will look like, and the steps that the client will take, and the steps that the housing counselor is initiating and coordinating to help them get back to their hopefully pre-disaster, or as close as they can.
Anybody have anything else to add? Any different criteria before I move on? No? Yes, you're looking like Megan.
Well, just to echo what Glenda said, and another thing, in terms of what we look at it for eligibility is, if they lived in a county that was impacted, and if they can actually show or impact from a disaster.
Okay.
I would just add one thing to that. I think the eligibility criteria for services is often something that is modified for disasters. So as we navigate the traditional social services landscape, we know that there are certain eligibility criteria for medical services or housing services or the traditional social services that are available. Folks don't necessarily, when they are impacted by a disaster, it may not be somebody who is traditionally trying to navigate that system on a day-to-day basis, and so they're new to trying to figure out where to go to get resources because they were impacted by the disaster and otherwise don't have any chronic needs. So understanding disaster eligibility criteria and what makes a person eligible for a program versus what makes them eligible on blue sky days is critical. So the criteria changes in the disaster, and it also changes throughout the lifetime of the long-term recovery for the disaster survivor because programs change, funding sources change, funding amounts change, and all of those things. So I think a major difference, I think you nailed it when you said the kind of the chronic issues, but on top of that is actually really helping people to understand disaster eligibility criteria and the programs that might be available that wouldn't otherwise be.
Yeah, but that's one of the things that's been, each of you have just different criterias, okay? And that's rather unusual. That's kind of not how some previous disasters were managed around the country. But there's a lot of different criteria. So managing the criteria, figuring out how to refer, how to get people assistance is very important. So that's information sharing, making sure databases are used. That's the really only thing we can do is to make sure we get that all aligned. And I think as these new programs, now another layer of programs start coming in, because you have what they're calling the National Void Coalition, but the FEMA-funded, Texas-funded programs, that's going to be their own criteria. The city housing program is going to have criteria too. So I think we're going to need, this is going to be very challenging for us to make sure we really get it and we understand how that fits in with clients. Because when we look at a client, it's like, okay, what happened to you with Harvey?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then it's more like, how do we find a way to help that need, but based on the criteria that might be available for the different agencies or which we might have internally.
Yes. And I think that's part of our data guru's attempt to get us all headed in the same direction with this lovely document. As cumbersome as it looks to us, again, remember the client, right? So if this looks cumbersome to us, it is that much so for them. And so how do we continue to coordinate and communicate amongst each other so that we can make this process as seamless as humanly possible?
Yeah, and really quick, just to add to what Daniel said, case management really is the hub for services. And so through case management is how our neighbors access home repair, legal aid, and a lot of other critical services that they need. And so thinking about that and what Daniel said, not only do we need to understand from a case management point of view, eligibility for a disaster, you know, one of the things that we looked at and what we talked about earlier was home repairs and referring clients into home repair. And even with that, you know, agencies have a lot of different criteria. So for case managers, it's really to understand what their role is and how far they go into the process. And so, you know, a lot of us work off of referrals, and our job is to refer clients out to services. And in that, we case managers can't necessarily keep up with every different criteria for home repair agencies. So it's about making that connection and that match to get people in the right directions to be able to receive services, and then incumbent on the home repair or other agencies to make that final determination in terms of eligibility.
So you just led us into our next point. So I'll start with you, Daniel. Talk to me about, and I used to be in outreach, so I call it the secret sauce, that organizations should be using to provide referrals specifically for special populations in our community.
We've often shared with our partners, in our example, is that we have the language and cultural access support that we can provide for our partners too. You don't have to transfer the client. We can actually work with you and collaborate on things. And a lot of people thought of that just as language, and not quite realizing that maybe culture has a lot more to do with the way people think of their own identities, how they want to approach assistance, how they want to think of their homes. And that culture can be ethnic, it can be age. There's a lot of different circumstances. And I think if we look at everybody as this unique being and how do we engage them, I think that's an important way of doing things and making sure we listen. I think any kind of outreach activities and communication should involve a really intentionality about listening to hearing what the individuals are saying. The partner agencies we found, though, as they've gotten used to this and gotten used to working together, are realizing certain people, why aren't they don't want our help. That's one thing you see. That's usually a flag that there's a cultural issue, okay? And then the other thing is we've been trying to work with them, but they just don't seem to really get it. But then they're seeing that it's sometimes when we just go in and talk with them in a certain way and work with them in a certain way, usually they understand or they're more open to trust, because with culture comes trust issues too. And so that's why your relationships you have is very important with the clients. And then in how we refer, I think referrals need to be worked in partnership instead of just kind of moving people on. There should still be that touch that's maintained between the agencies. And just one example for housing, people weren't wanting housing repairs, and one of the things that we did is to just escort them and take them to see how it works. Go see a home where something actually happened, what made a difference in another family's life. And sometimes people need to see things. That's a part of a culture. And so I think it's just looking at each individual uniquely and thinking of like, oh, this is a challenge. And instead of thinking, oh no, it's a burden, I think you should be thinking of it as kind of a fun challenge. And if your teams approach things that way, I think you can have a lot more success.
Michelle and Glenda, could you all add outreach strategy, particularly around undocumented Houstonians, our seniors in our communities? What strategies are you finding that's really working? How are you connecting and serving with those populations?
Well, I know at the Urban League, as I stated, earlier on, we targeted specific subdivisions, and we actually went out after folks came home from work for like 2 hours every evening. We had our housing counselors do actually door knocking and canvassing, and they just left their business card at the door, or they talked to a neighbor and asked them to share the information with other neighbors, and specifically targeted communities where they actually saw the debris of the disaster. And if folks were out moving about so that they could actually engage and have a conversation, because the Urban League is a trusted name in the community already. Some were familiar with it and knew of it, and then our housing counselors were bilingual, and so that enabled them to communicate effectively. And let them know that, I'm going to be here, I'm going to be in the community, I'm going to be in the neighborhood, the direct contact number to call or email and text we found works very, very well, is what they did mostly. And then that was primarily on the north side of town. And then on the south side of town, it was via civics groups and community groups, some of our faith-based partners, and definitely during the parent engagement in feeder patterns of school for high school, middle, and elementary. We're in sections of town where we went out. Then that was very effective because they were there for their child to support them, but found the services, and so it was a good wraparound support.